I decided to have a series devoted to books. A lot of people my age and the previous generation spent a lot of time reading books. I personally grew up without TV, so when I was young I read a lot of books. And in those days even a book was a fabulous thing because sometimes even if it was a fiction book, you get into it and you read and your mind goes off and you can imagine all kinds of things. It keeps the brain cells going. And you can actually learn a tremendous amount of very important things by reading books. Now, there's millions of books out there these days, and they compete for shelf space and so on. And sometimes it's hard to come up with books that you really like. There's popular books that maybe a lot of people read, but personally I'm not interested in them. So I come across some interesting gems now and then, and I decided to make a series recommending some books. So the first couple of books are about soil and gardening. It's really important these days, and for the longest time, back into distant memory in the human race, human beings, we have farmed. And there's a lot of different approaches to farming over the years, and some very ancient techniques are still being used today in many parts of the world, such as growing rice on tiers and very simple handmade irrigation systems. Now, this book here, called From the Good Earth, it has very interesting photographs and illustrations and text about places all around the world and how they do their agriculture. And the author's name is Michael Abelman. So I highly recommend that book. Beautiful book to have on the table, and you can learn how people have been farming for such a long time and how important it is to us. And related to that is a book by Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird, The Secrets of the Soil. Now this book is incredible. I've just gotten into it, but I read Peter Tompkins wrote the book about the pyramids. He wrote about monoliths, obelisk rather, and he also wrote The Secret Life of Plants. And he, fascinating mind, teamed up with Christopher Bird. Incredible stuff. The soil is so important in the way ancient cultures used their soil. Some of them were very successful over thousands of years, and some weren't. And without our good soil, of course, we don't have any good thing to eat. So those are two books related to agriculture. Now, another book that just came out, The Book of Symbols, by the Archive for Research in Archetypal Symbolism and Reflections on Archetypal Images. Incredibly fascinating book, just full of pictures and images, something like 1,500, 2,000, I don't even know the number of symbols that are in here. Beautiful writing, very well laid out, a great coffee table book, and just so elegant, beautiful book. And symbols have been so important for thousands of years, and even today in photography and imagery and movies and so on, advertising, symbols are used. They evoke something from deep within us, and many, many symbols go back for thousands of years. They're deeply embedded in our collective memory as a human race. And I highly recommend this book. And now, another book that just came out, and I just got this book. Well, it's not too old, actually. Jeremy Narby. Jeremy Narby was a anthropologist, got his PhD, went down to some place in South America and lived there for 2 years. Just completely lived like talk about shock to your system. Try to go living in a place like that for a while. And what he discovered was that the people that handed down the information about plants said that they consumed some of the plants and it had an effect on them. And in these dream states or out-of-body states, beings told them all about their plants and what you could eat and all kinds of other information. Now, this is what they said. And of course, they knew the plants very well. Now, this book, The Cosmic Serpent, is about an exploration into how human beings in the past used natural substances that they encountered long before we had our big cultures and civilizations with our regulatory systems and so on, and came to understand certain things through intuition, through the teachers of the plants and other nature beings that they encountered. And this is the story they told. But how can you account for it? Fascinating book. I expect to really get into this book very soon. I heard an interview. He's on internet. Just look him up. Jeremy Narby. Now, the last book I'm going to recommend is just a lot of fun. One of my most popular subjects for me personally, since a long time ago when I was very young, got into astronomy, Star Trek, all that kind of stuff. I studied electronics, was the whole subject of flying saucers. And you just can't evade that subject, because once you start down that road, you look into it and say, look, something very unusual is going on, has been going on, is going on. The stories are too long, too many, from too many people in too many ways. So the point, the hardest thing to understand is, where do we turn a switch inside where we finally understand, look, things are not as we seem, think they are. And now, there's a fellow named George Adamski in the 1950s. I just got into this book, but I read it before, I believe, many years ago, and I've heard his story. In 1946, he had some kind of an incident. There was an incident that involved bouncing radar off the moon in October of 1946, and he claimed that he had encountered some beings that were from another planet, and they took him for rides. Okay, now this sounds really crazy, but this is long before the current TV and all the stuff and the abduction scenarios. What he came out with, if you look at the explanation and all the different things that he said, now this was written very early on in our history. After there was 1947, there was Roswell, and then in the 50s it started to get very unusual. There were a lot of unusual things going on, and a lot of very famous science fiction material was written at that time. Now, this is a very, very fascinating story by the guy a long time ago. He said, this is what, and now, the stuff he said is very, very fascinating. Basically, sort of like an electronic universe and the planets, and that, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but this is a very, very fascinating book. So if you really want to tickle your brain, Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery, the strange, the peoples, the powers, the events. So, the thing is that along with this book, there are other stories from that era. In Brazil, in I believe it was Switzerland later, some very, very unusual stories. And people were just saying, yes, there were a lot of kooks, of course. You know, there were, but some people had some very coherent things to say, and they weren't the kind of people who, you know, were given to that sort of thing. They just said, well, look, something happened to me, and I spoke with these beings, and, you know, that's what they said. So, I mean, the thing is that these stories go back into way long time ago in human history. So, I recommend this book, and I look forward to hearing from my visitors books that they recommend, because I'm always interested in hearing what people have on their mind.